We are now in public session. Okay. At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Service, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient just to put phones in silent mode, as they will maintain a level of interference in the broadcasting system. Item number 4. Before we begin, we will just record our decision on the EU Scrutiny Schedule A-COM 217753 and proposal for a directive of the European Parliament and of the Council on the quality of water intended for human consumption. It is proposed that this proposal doesn't warrant further scrutiny. It's also proposed that this proposal be discussed at the meeting of the committee on the 18th of December. Is that agreed? Today's discussion is funding and delivery of public housing under Rebuilding Ireland. Today's meeting will involve resuming consideration of the funding and delivery of public housing under Rebuilding Ireland. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome from Galway City Council Mr Brendan McGrath, Mr Dermot Mahan, from Limerick City and County Council Mr Con Murray and Ms Aoife Duke, from Louth County Council Mr Joe McGuinness and Mr Paddy Donnelly, and from Kerry County Council Ms Maura Murrell and Mr Martin O'Donoghue at today's meeting. Just a note on privilege before we begin. I wish to draw to your attention to the fact, by virtue of Section 17.2 of the Defamation Act 2019, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to the particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that not only evidence connected with the subject matter and these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person or identity by name or in such a way to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the House or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Just to allow the witnesses, just before he came in there, because of our tight schedule, the committee decided to take your opening statements as read, if you're agreeable to that, and we'll go straight into questioning rather than having all statements read out. So I'll open up Owen.
Thanks to everybody for taking the time to travel down to us. I suppose one of the key issues that this committee has been looking at is both the targets for meeting social and affordable housing need under Rebuilding Ireland and then the delivery of those units. So my questions, and it's the same question for each of the local authorities, governs that. The first one is many of us here have a concern that the targets, particularly for I suppose, what many of us call real social housing, so that's units that are owned by local authorities or approved housing bodies, are far short of the overall level of need in each of your own local authority areas. And what I mean by that is, if you take, for example, your current net housing list, if you also take your HAP transfer list, that gives you what I call a kind of a real social housing need in your local authority area. If you match that then against the targets in Rebuilding Ireland, even including the leasing, so for the builds, the acquisitions and the leasing, in general, over the next kind of 3 to 4 years, you're going to meet a third at best of the real social housing need. Now, I know the answer that we will get from the Minister is that yes, but everybody else will be met through, for example, HAP and RAS and etc. But I suppose the first question is do you have a view, or are you concerned that there's such a wide gap between the additions to the real social housing stock and the level of needs that there in terms of your own lists and your HAP transfer list? So that's the first question. The second, obviously, then is in affordable housing, and I appreciate a lot of local authorities are kind of waiting to see what happens with the cost rental pilots in terms of the Dublin, Dunleary Rathdown and Cork pilots. And obviously the Service Sites Fund was only initially made available to a small number of local authorities, 11, but the expectation is it will be made available to others. But I would like to get the view of each of your housing departments in terms of what you think the level of need for affordable housing is, both purchase and rental, in your own administrative areas. If you have no idea of the need, and I suspect you don't, because I certainly know I don't have any idea of the need in my own local authority area, what it is that we need to do to establish that level of need, and whether or not the delivery of affordable rental or purchase homes led by the local authorities or by the local authorities and the approved housing bodies is factoring in your plans over the next number of years. The third question then relates to the infamous one-stage approval process, and I'd just be interested to know, have any of you used the one-stage process? If you have, how much use have you made of it? If you haven't, could you let us know why? Is it because your build projects are of a larger size, or because of the risk issues involved? And do you think, or what would you like to see in the amended one-stage process in terms of the upper financial limits or greater sharing of risk with the department? And the age-old question of whether or not the four-stage process is improving or not. So we're talking to some local authorities and they're telling us, no, it's not improving, the timelines are still too slow. There's still too much back and forth between the local authorities and the department in terms of the approval stage. Or one of the issues when we had some of your counterparts for the local authorities recently is, what can we do to try and speed up the procurement? So, for example, have any of your local authorities considered the issue of, instead of having to go out to tender for every single new build project, could we move to a stage where we would have, for example, regional framework agreements where clusters of local authorities do a big bag tender to get X number of contractors on the shelf, maybe for developments up to 50, from 50 to 100, etc. But what can we do, or what would be, given your expertise in the procurement end, what could this committee be arguing with the department to try and find a way of speeding that up? Because I do know that's a source of frustration for many local authorities and delay in the delivery of projects. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Noel, if you want to come in now.
Yeah, thanks, Les Clare-Look, and then thanks for giving the opportunity. I know I'm not a member of this committee, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to come in for a few moments. Just, I suppose, particularly, well, one thing that I'd like to, if each Chief Executive can outline how many people that they have in emergency accommodation and what plans they're planning to do to get people out of emergency accommodation and in to proper accommodation, and is the numbers decreasing or increasing, and what is it still down to the people, developer or landowner selling, or householder selling houses, or people that have rented houses? Is it banks repossessing still, or is it just that they're selling houses now in the open market with an increase in the valuation of houses? Just if I could direct a few questions to Galway, where I want to welcome Brenda McGrath, Chief Executive, and Dermot McMahon. In Galway, maybe if you could outline how many houses are you short at the moment, and how many houses would you need to get over the crisis, and what is being done to try and deliver that? And also, could you outline how many houses are you hoping to build between now and say 2021, and what plans are in place to build these houses? Are they gone to approval, or have they been approved, or are they gone to tender? And maybe if you can outline what you see is your frustration in holding up, or what are the blockages in trying to get projects across the line? Is it with the department, getting approval from the department, or is it trying to get contracts signed to get houses? We have a major crisis, and I'm sure every county has that, and I'm sure there has to be some sort of, as my colleague Deputy O'Brien said, there has to be some mechanism of fast-tracking building houses. I'm aware of a scheme in Galway County that was held up in the Department of Housing for a matter of months just to get approval, and where particularly a number of windows were going to be in a particular part of the development, and it was held up where we were told there was only one architect within the department. Do you find that, or does that still happen? And also in Galway, have you enough land to deal with the housing crisis? Not just for people on social or affordable housing, but the ordinary people out there that want to buy a house. We're seemingly to forget about the young couples that don't qualify for social or affordable housing, that want to go out and buy a house. And I see it in Galway, and I'd like to know, is it happening in other parts of the country also, where the state is actually coming in and buying up full housing estates? Where I've seen a number of estates in Galway where the state has come in, bought the whole lot in one foul swoop, and it's very unfair. And young couples that want to get on the property market, they cannot bid against the state. We have a housing crisis, But we have a housing crisis, and also with young couples, a lot of them are heading back home, staying with their parents because they just can't afford to pay rent. They can't afford to get on the property ladder because the prices are going up, and they can't bid against the state. Also, just 1 second now. Yeah. In Galway in particular, and I wonder if there's another issue around the country. I go into Galway every Sunday morning early, and from the top of Shop Street down to the end of Shop Street, I think I counted 22 rough sleepers indoors in the space of maybe 50 or 60, 70 metres or 100 metres max. And by 8:30, they're gone. There's no sign of them. They walk down the sideways, laneways. Next thing, they're like as if they disappear, but they're back again at night between 11 and 12. So I want to know what has been done about that. I think it's a disgrace to see so many. And I'm going to be honest, I have actually stood up and walked down and looked at them. Every one of them are foreign. None of them are Irish. And I'd like to know, Brendan, as Chief Executive from Galway, has anything been done? A survey, or have you talked to them, or who are they and where they're from, and what's been done to deal with that? I think it's terrible looking in the mornings, and there is a lot of tourists that walk around cities early in the morning, and to see that, I wonder, is that being addressed? Maybe also, if you can give us an outline where the future development of this Galway city is. I know you've done a lot of work, and I want to compliment you on that, in progressing the Ardán corridor on the east side of Galway City. The road has been downgraded, funding has been got, I know, on that, Brendan, to progress, to get access to it. But when do you actually physically expect to see houses built on that? How many houses are you hoping that will be built on? When can you actually physically see people moving in to these houses? And also, maybe if you can outline, as I said, how many people are actually in emergency accommodation in Galway, and when do you expect to be in a position to get that down to zero? And when you get people in, how many people are going, what is the trend on people getting on the emergency housing accommodation? How many in an average per month are presenting at Galway City Council as homeless? Are the families single people? Maybe you can just give us a rough outline of that, and maybe the other chief executives can do that also, as to what is the trend of every month, how many is presenting as homeless, and are the families, couples, or what? As I said, Chairman, thank you for, I don't remember the committee, but thank you to give me the opportunity to ask a few questions.
Maybe we'll go back and get answers to the first two questions, and then we'll start maybe with Galway. Sorry, not too sure.
I suppose I'll deal with maybe Deputy Grealish's questions later. Is that okay with you, or do you want me to deal with?
Whichever way you want to do it. It's just that I know Deputy Grealish is in a hurry to leave us,
and I think he's going to leave. So
we might be glad to get rid of him too. But anyway.
No, yeah, and Con Murray, who's here as Chief Executive of Limerick, happens to be also the chair of the Housing Subcommittee to CCMA, so he maybe takes some of those general issues as well. Yeah. Look, just specifically on Galway, and you appreciate that sadly the homeless figure does fluctuate. At the moment, we have 189 adults in emergency accommodation and just over 100 children also in emergency accommodation. We've recently opened the Winter Beds Initiative, where we've increased capacity since last year. We'll have 36 beds available to us, and we also have contingency beds if that is insufficient. That'll run through to next April and extended beyond that if necessary. We also have a men's hostel, Fair Green Hostel, run by Cope, which is a homeless charity in Galway, with 36 beds which are full, and the female hostel is also full, where there are 13 beds. This year we've made 20 allocations of homeless families into social housing. Unfortunately, it's a difficult cycle and a difficult problem, because we have another currently 49 families on notices to quit who conceivably will come onto our homeless list in the first quarter of 2019. We've made significant number of interventions to deal with the homeless challenge. It includes a HAP homeless place finder service, which is up and running since June. We've already been able to house 44 families under the homeless HAP. 27 of those are families, and a further 17 couples and some singles who were also registered have been housed through that initiative. The cold weather response I've referred to. We've recently purchased a family hub. Renovation work is actually starting next week. It'll be up and running in Q1, and that will accommodate 12 families. We're rolling out a modular housing scheme comprising of 15 prefabricated 2- and 3-bedroom units on lands in the city ownership. That again will be up and running in the early part of 2019. And through the Housing First initiative, where we've set ourselves a target of 30 Housing First tenancies, we've also secured funding through the Social Reform Fund, which is a philanthropic fund. It provides a wraparound service working with disability services, mental health services, the HSE, and is providing a wraparound service to homeless people who we are putting into housing accommodation. And also recently work has commenced on a new domestic violence refuge in the city, which will be ready late next year, and that will provide 9 additional units of accommodation. We have a rough sleeping problem. A significant element of that, we have beds for everybody who needs a bed this winter, and we will have a bed for anybody requiring a bed this winter. The rough sleeping problem are largely non-habitual residents, so they don't have residency status. They are generally Eastern European. We have engaged with them consistently, but they've refused offers of support other than winter packs. They are destitute, sadly, in their own countries, and some of those would be engaged in activities. You know, young people coming out at night time would see them and give them money, etc. And they don't particularly want to engage with the services. And you're right, they do disappear the following morning, and that is a problem. And we're trying to there's probably a policy intervention that's needed there, to be frank with you, involving Foreign Affairs and Justice around the whole non-habitual residency piece, which would help ameliorate the challenge that we have. In terms of housing supply in Galway, there's been virtually very little private housing built in Galway since 2007. Currently, we estimate that there's a shortage of about 3,000 units of accommodation. The city's population is growing organically by about 1,000 people a year. That would typically suggest you'd require 300, 350 units of accommodation just to keep pace. So we probably have a pent-up demand that needs to be dealt with. There are extant planning permissions in Galway City that can deliver 6,020 units. The work we're doing around the brownfield sites and the new suburb at Ardawn has the capacity to accommodate 3,500 units of accommodation. And as you mentioned, Deputy Grealish, we've begun work on Ardawn. We've in the last fortnight attracted urban regeneration funds to deal with the access issues, and that will be go to site later in 2019. The city Galway City Council is challenged in terms of our own land banks. At the moment, we have 18 hectares of land which are suitable for housing. We're currently building on or about to start building on 10 of those hectares. The next 6.5 hectares will go to site next year. Galway City Council at the moment has about 2,300 social houses. By the end of 2021, we'll have increased that number by 50%. And that will create its own challenge for us in terms of future maintenance and management of those and developing sustainable communities. So we're making very, very significant inroads, I believe, into tackling the issue. One of the quirks at the moment of the lack of private building in Galway is that about 85% of what's been built is either going to AHBs or is local authority building, which means that there is a severe shortage of affordable housing and other housing options for people who are outside of the social housing qualification criteria. And that's exacerbated because those people are generally in rents. The rents are increasing because of the market shortage. And on the other hand, then they're under pressure to meet the central bank targets in terms of affordability and mortgages. So yeah, there is an issue there. I think, Deputy, I've probably answered most of your questions. If there's not, I'll happily come back in, Chair.
Okay, appreciate that. Maybe we'll move on to Mr. Murphy Hughes.
Thank you. Here, look,
You know, we've just, yeah.
Just to make sure you see me.
I see you
okay.
there. How could I not see you? If I don't see you,
Sometimes I know your vision can be
if I don't
myopic.
see you, I'll definitely hear you.
Oh, I will miss you.
Sorry.
Go away, man.
Mr.
look,
Murphy.
yes.
Murray, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll address some of the questions more in general in terms of has been raised. Rather, if there's any specific questions about Limerick, I'll gladly address those as well. But we did give a very detailed submission in terms of what we are doing. The targets, just in terms of rebuilding Ireland, and the question is, are they realistic or not? They are the targets, and they are the targets that have been set for the respective authorities, and we will achieve those targets. Now, the specific question I think Deputy O'Brien is referring to in terms of direct build, which has always been a lot of questions.
Just additions to the actual local authority approved housing body stock through bills or purchases as opposed to leased private sector units.
Okay, apologies, I misunderstood that. In terms of what the policy is that we work under, all aspects of rebuilding Ireland are what are worked on and delivered through in order to provide appropriate accommodation for the people who are on our housing lists. It's a different debate as to whether that is long-term or the other element of the tenure, and we'll work with that in terms of whatever the direction comes to us as we deliver on that. But we have been very successful in delivering to date in relation to the policies that have been set, whether it be on HAP or indeed as leasing as it is growing. The direct build, as I referred to in terms of turnkey operation, are critically important. We need to see a strong balance emerging between private sector building and public housing in order to ensure that we have an appropriate tenure mix, but also that we're meeting the different markets and the demands that are out there. And that relates to the question in relation to affordability. Because unless we start to see very significant improvement in starter homes, we will never move to address that particular aspect of it. And one of the key areas that obviously we'd like to see more advancement on is the actual loan that's available to people from an affordable perspective. It's an excellent loan. It's a very good rate. And it's a question of how can we make that and mobilise that and get it working far quicker to enable people to get the starter and take some of the pressure off some of the other sectors that are clearly under pressure. The element of speed of delivery and just, I suppose, from a slightly historical perspective and the various policies that we've worked under over the last 30 years, and I've worked under most of them, between the local authority being the actual provider to the introduction of the approved housing bodies and the move at one stage towards the actual emphasis being placed on the approved housing bodies, and as we readdress that, the different elements between private approved bodies and ourselves. So there have been different shifts that have taken place. As a consequence of that, particularly over the last 8 years, you've seen local authorities not geared up to the level of delivery as there was a different sector being provided. So it has taken time, and we acknowledge that, in actually resourcing and rebuilding our respective departments, our people, and expertise in order to drive forward with the type of bills. And I believe we've ramped up quite considerably. In terms of 2018, I do believe the targets will be achieved overall. Individual targets in respect of what's been set by various authorities, there are different challenges that are faced by individual authorities, and that's down to some of the processes. You will be up some years, you'll be slightly down, but overall as a sector, it's important that we are measured in that regard. Turnkeys are an important part of that, I believe, and if you look at process in terms of either the stages that was mentioned earlier in terms of the 4-stage, or indeed the direct provision to a turnkey, you'll see yourselves the speed at which a turnkey can be turned around and delivered as distinct from the 4-stage process. And that does depend on the activity that's taken place within your respective county. Just a slight comment, if I might, in relation to the 4-stage process. Have there been improvements? There has. And we've seen with the introduction of the 59-week process, that enables us to work more clearly to define timelines. Would we like to see further improvements? We would. We do see and have indicated that potentially the 4-stage process could be reduced to 2. And the second stage, the first stage, should become a combination of stage 1 and 2. And therefore, prior to formal planning permission, it's more sufficient at the first stage. And that's to ensure that we have confidence in going forward. And I'm a great believer that, yeah, of course.
If you reduced it down to 2, what do you think would be the reduction in the time from conception to, say, being on site for construction? Because at the minute it's about 18 months, depending on the project.
The difficulty, through the Chair, I have in answering that is stage 1 and 2 are dependent very much on the planning process. And that can be different depending on the local authority or the issues or the location within which you want to build. And therefore, once you get to a stage that you have planning, and you can actually bring it into the process then of formal adjudication, you can speed up the times. So the initial one is always hard to judge, but once you get to the point where you have planning and surety around the capital appraisal, you can move forward.
And do you mind me asking, does the new statutory time frame for the Part 8 process not reduce that time frame significantly? I mean, because now at least we have a start and an end point in statute for Part 8s. So is it surely the delay now is outside of the planning, whereas before the planning was clearly a problem?
I don't want to be perfectly honest, to be blaming planning, but there's a reality here in terms of the challenges that often face our elected members at the local level in terms of what's being produced. Now, I'm, I suppose, fortunate in terms of Limerick. They have supported the delivery of some very critical Part A process in recent times that gives me a 2019 programme. That doesn't happen everywhere, in fairness, depending on the challenges that are there. So the statutory time frame itself does not take away from our obligation to ensure that both the community are heard and that the elected body have their say. So from that perspective, what I'm saying is if we bring a bit more surety to that, and then the stage process delivers in relation to that, it gives more accountability and responsibility at local level in relation to what they do. So that's where I would come from, and that's the argument that I would put forward in that regard. In relation to the emergency accommodation in terms of homelessness, I mean, it remains and is a very serious challenge in different parts of the country itself. And it's something that we talk as an individual as distinct from a sectoral element, because the challenges are quite different depending where you are. In my particular place, we would have 31 families at this stage in bed and breakfast. At the end of 2017, we reduced the overall, which was 79 families, down to, by 93%, down to 5 at that point in time. But it has built up during the year again. We have introduced one hub where we have 10 families, two hubs, sorry, with 10 families, and then other sheltered accommodation. We find housing first to be critically important, and we're embarking on that successfully in ensuring that families who need that type of support while moving into the community, and also to give support to the community themselves, that these people are being looked after, is critically important. And that has worked very, very well for us. At the moment, with 31 families, we are addressing a new hub at this point in time, which I hope to have early in the new year. But there will be accommodation for everybody, as Brendan has always indicated, as we face into the winter. The actual delivery programme, I should have said this when I started out, I mean, we very quickly forget that we had an extraordinary winter which lasted 5 months at the beginning of the year, which did have an impact in direct delivery, not just for the public sector, but also for the private sector itself. If we get a fair wind, we can see an increase and continued increase in terms of delivery. We have used the emergency planning powers in order to deliver hubs in the community itself. It's not something that we want to do in terms of going against either the wishes of the community or indeed the council itself, but it is there. We have used it practically in order to ensure that it can be delivered. The other aspects that perhaps would require a little bit more debate around the single stage. It's something we are looking at ourselves directly. Have we used it to date? No. We have one going through this at this point in time, mainly because of the complexity of the areas that we were dealing with in the context of the city and the metropolitan area. The single stage did not give the assurity in terms of the challenges that sometimes you face on brownfield sites. But it is something that is worth looking at. I do believe it should be greater than the 2 million. I think it should be far greater than 8 units. And perhaps...
Would you care to put a figure on what you think it would be, or what it should be?
Sorry, 6 million. 6 million. Sorry, apologies. Yeah.
Although, just to be clear, well, that's a commitment. That's not something that has actually happened yet, and that's quite an important. That isn't yet available to local authorities.
It'll be available from January.
Sorry,
I'm going to plan for that, but I would have thought, yeah.
Well, as I said, we have one going through the pipeline at this point in time in that regard, and obviously we would increase that. I certainly would look again, depending on the area in the country and the demands that are upon you in terms of the spend that's there, and going back to your list and so on. I mean, I believe it could be increased to 10 million, and depending on, again, the cost of operations in the area. And that could be looked at a regional basis, as distinct from a specific local authority aspect. But it is something which is there. The processes and the relationship with the department at this point in time is excellent, and we find that we are getting the type of response that is expected and supported in terms of delivery on the ground. So if there are any other questions, Chair, I'll come back.
Yeah, we'll have a second round. Mr. McGuinness, do you want to?
Yeah, Chairman, on behalf of Louth County Council and maybe going through Deputy O'Brien's questions, in relation to target versus need, the Louth target for 2018 is for 308 units and a 3-year target of 1,147. We are going to be very close in relation to the 2018 target, and I'm very confident we'll exceed the 3-year target. Now that target is largely being delivered by a 4 AHB CAF funded units, which are producing significant numbers in Louth, largely due to the rent levels that can be achieved, because the rental market is quite strong, being so close to Dublin, and that is probably the success of the CAF scheme. In relation to the specific question, target versus need, I suppose if the members refer back to the 1980s when that was seen as the most buoyant time for local authority construction, we were probably constructing in the region of about 250 units versus our target now of 308. So we would feel our target is challenging. We're going to be very close to it. There will always be a housing need. That's a fact of life, and there always was a housing need. It's a matter of catching up with what has happened in the last short number of years. In relation to the question on do we think there is a need for affordable housing, I would say there's 2 elements to that answer. First of all, the market isn't yet supporting affordable housing for us. Market price versus construction price have not matched yet. Construction, the availability of construction labour is heavily influencing the price of construction, particularly with us in Louth again, because Dublin is sucking in all the skilled labour into Dublin. So for us to get local labour, we're crossing the border. Most of our contractors are from Northern Ireland, etc. So it's affecting the market price of a house. Whether there are people then fit to acquire affordable units, we would look, the financial institutions have a part to play in providing the finance for those units. We look at our rent schemes, and we see our average rents going up. So there is more money there, tenants have more money, etc. But it really is supply and demand in relation to, and the Deputy is quite correct, it's a very hard question to ask. We have used a single stage process. We've used it once, and we are currently using it for our CPO units, which we do in bundles. It requires an element of work, particularly pre-planning work, preparing schemes, and particularly the costing of schemes to ensure that we have the costings correct. But the single stage process has worked for us, and we welcome the first increase in the limits, and we will welcome the second increase that's coming in January. But it does require an element of work which we're happy to take on. In relation to emergency accommodation in Louth, we would have a range of between 120 and 160 adults in emergency accommodation. We've peaked at 160. There's various reasons for presentations that have been already mentioned. I made the comment in our submission that traditionally, we would always have had a homeless population of perhaps 40 to 50 individuals, going right back to the 1980s. So the issue is the difference between the 50 and the 160 now, and they are a different cohort than we had previously. We're talking about the people who have lost units, particularly from the buy-to-let sector, where units have been taken back by the financial institutes, and that would be one of our more significant grounds for presentations, where the landlord has lost the property, and it's the tenant then who presents homeless. So we have families that we never had families presenting homeless. We have opened our first hub. We have used private leases, and we used the HAP scheme to get accommodation for those people. It is an everyday challenge with regard to homelessness, even in a small county like Louth. Thank you, Chair.
Merle, do you?
I suppose in the Kerry perspective, and the Kerry in relation to housing, we have a very strong, very high targets, and our targets to the end of the period is 1,780 units. If you take that, there's 840 build, 310 turnkeys, 360 acquisitions, and 270 leasing. So really, the targets, they're strong targets when we look at it outside of the Cork authorities, the Dublin authorities, and Kildare. We have the highest targets in the country to achieve. So we certainly have a huge focus on achieving those targets. I suppose in relation to land and social housing, every piece of land that we can build on, we are building on to achieve the targets, plus we're actively going out there acquiring land as well to build for our purposes. I suppose in looking at affordability, we're a bit like my colleague in Louth, insofar as it's a different county insofar as you do have the tourism factor, and certainly with 2 million visitor each year into the county, the short-term lets, the Airbnb factor is a strong factor and is competing between residential and tourism. So the changes in policy there is something which will certainly impact in the Kerry situation. Separately to that as well, we haven't seen, we've seen some green shoots in part of the county in relation to the private market, but we have parts of the county where the private market is essentially, there is little activity. And essentially through the very strong programme that we have, we will be the developers at this stage, and we will be the people developing housing in many of the areas across the county. From meetings with the CIF in the county, they would certainly, it's a bit like the Louth situation, that actually at this point in time in parts of the county it is cheaper to buy a property than it is to build a property at this point in time, and that's the situation on the ground. Also, I suppose the matter of procurement was raised as well, and I suppose when you're looking at procurement and how you deliver procurement, it's part of the process, a vital part of any process, obviously, but there's also the rural factor. But we've built directly as Kerry County Council 65 units this year, local authority houses, and when you look at that, really, they've been small schemes. There are 20 schemes, and when you look at our programme, we'll have very few big schemes. There will be, smaller schemes, and that's the type of county we are. So I think, local-based procurement as well as, I take the point on the regional procurement, but it's very important for our local labour market as well, because having the skills locally and having the contractors to be able to deliver at a time when we need them to deliver is hugely important. Finally, I suppose, in relation to homeless at this point in time, we have an increase in homelessness. We have 131 adults and 63 dependents, and we do not have rough sleepers in the county. And we're while we're dealing with the situation, it certainly is something which has increased in the county. If you look at our approaches, we're working very closely on a cross-agency basis, and the wraparound services, it's strong and it's working well in the county. We've seen increase in resources recently, which is very welcome. We've had approval from the department to up our resources, such as HAP placement, and that as have the HSE. And the HAP actually has been a very important one for us in placing people. And, with the HAP placement officer, we will see that activity, even within a shrinking market of available properties, I think will be very important for us. The strong housing programme should alleviate and create some space within the private market in relation to homelessness. And we also have been in discussions with the department about the creation of additional family hub facilities in the county.
I just want to make the members aware that we have to conclude this meeting at 10:30 because we need a 15-minute 11:30. We need a 15-minute recess before we go back to the local government bill. So if the members can keep their contribution short. Darragh.
I'll ask you here to current Fulcher of Galar, Godin Kishta, and you. Two things I just want to first I want to say to thank each of you and your housing teams for the work that you're doing. And I know it's particularly acute with the homeless crisis that we have all across the country, and I'm aware, certainly from visiting local authorities across the country and indeed my own in Fingal, of the level of work and emergency work that goes in, and the response has to be nearly immediate. And I know it's stressful for staff. I think that has to be something that we can't forget as well, because particularly when people are presenting in chaotic circumstances, very difficult circumstances where they're either evicted, a tenancy has been ended, or due to be. It's extremely stressful, and it is on your staff too. So I would like to just put on the record and to bring back to your own teams, your housing teams and everyone associated, my particular thanks, and that indeed of the committee, for the work they're doing every single day, and it's 7 days a week, and I know it is. So I do genuinely appreciate it. My colleagues have covered a number of items. I just want to make a couple of very brief comments. I was interested in the question relating to affordability, obviously emanated out of the fact that, as you know, that the Service Site Fund has increased to 310 million over 3 years, that there will be an affordable housing scheme established. The purpose of that scheme is actually to look at areas where there are affordability issues. So I don't envisage a scheme would be opened in areas where there aren't affordability issues. So I think the Rebuilding Ireland loan and improvements to that system itself, common criteria, common financial underwriting. And that's one thing I do want to ask each of you. Have, through your own, I think, Mr. Mahon, you're on the housing. You're the chair of housing on the CCMA. Is that right? No. Mr. Murray, Tyrone, Mr. Murray. Yeah. So maybe just for you, you can come back to the criteria for financial underwriting for the Rebuilding Ireland loans. Is, in your view, is it uniform across local authorities? The evidence I have, it's not. I've raised it with Minister Murphy before, and he says there's a review happening to ensure that that's happening. And could you maybe advise me what the interaction with the housing agency vis-à-vis the loans themselves? Is each loan application going back to the housing agency for oversight, if not approval? But I want to turn to something more general for each of you. And Mr. McGuinness raised it, and what all of you have actually alluded to it in your opening statements. But I want to talk about the use of CPO powers in each of your counties. What's been very useful about this morning is to get a picture from 4 local authorities that aren't in Dublin, and to look at the different issues different housing issues across the country. The figures are very, very different, and in each of your statements you've alluded to purchasing units. So don't take this as a complete criticism, but I'm wondering, when I look at Louth and Mr. McGuinness, that you've 84 completions as of the last figures I have in actually acquiring vacant houses and bringing them back in. So I think that is a very good performance, and I commend Louth for doing. You've been held up as an example as to how this can be done. When I look at Galway City in relation to completions, and I would ask people to correct this based on the FOI that I have, is that there are no completions. Kerry County Council, no completions. This is since 2011, and Limerick, none, under the CPO powers. Now, that was a Freedom of Information request that we put in. I do note in each of your statements you talk about acquiring buildings, but the information that came to me from the department basically says that Louth are miles ahead of everyone else. Is there an issue with using the CPO powers? Do local authorities not want to use them? Or, as the Minister has said on a number of occasions, the threat of the use of CPO may be enough. But when I look at Louth and the success that they've had in bringing vacant units in, Kerry County Council, you've mentioned in your opening statement, you've about 500, I think, derelict or unused buildings that you've identified. Or is that Kerry, or one of you? Was that Galway? No, Galway. So you've actually said that the Council prepared a vacant home strategy which has currently been implemented. The initial estimates put the number of vacant homes in the city at circa 500. So, but then when I look at how many times you've actually completed a CPO since 2011, there's none. So I'm wondering, why is that, and what other strategies you're using. I'm looking for your feedback on that. It's not, you can take it as a criticism, but it's not. I really want to get under the bonnet of it to see what the issue is. The discretionary cap that's been alluded to, Mr. Murray, in the one-stage process that Mr. McGuinness has used, do you think raising that cap to 6 million, what impact would that have when that comes in January in relation to giving you control over delivering the smaller social housing schemes that you have? Because that has been agreed in the last budget, that be increased. I was particularly interested in Mr. McGrath in Galway. You have the HAP Homeless Place Finder service. Do each of your local authorities have that, and do all local authorities across the country have it? One of the things that we're looking at as a party at the moment is obviously when people are presenting as homeless, a lot of it is when it's actually happened. And in some local authorities, don't have evidence in any of yours, but people are being told, well, come back when the tenancy is ceased. So can you tell me, in your own view, if someone comes to you and they know that they're going to be put out or their lease is up in 60 days or 80 days, what's the process in your own local authority? Maybe, Mr McGrath, for you, you might talk to me in more detail about the place finder service that you've had some success with. Now, on HAP, and I'll conclude now, I'll ask you here, is any of your HAP clients, are all of you removing them off the main housing list and putting them onto the transfer list, or are some of you, like I know that some local authorities have stopped doing that now? And what's your view of that? And maybe I don't think it's a policy question. I want to ask them from an operational perspective. I disagree with it. I think that HAP tenants should stay on the main housing list because we have proper oversight. So can I ask for each of the local authorities, do all of you remove someone who's placed in a HAP tenancy from the housing list? Because my big criticism of Rebuilding Ireland is that the over-dependency on the private rental sector, the over-dependency on HAP in particular, that over 50% of our targets are effectively to be met as people deemed housed, that their need is actually met by entering into, in the main, a short-term lease. And in my view, in my party's view, that means that their housing need has not actually been met. So I think, Sinead, I'll ask you here. Yeah, go on.
Okay, thanks, Fergus.
Thank you. That's fair. Look, I just want to first of all say that it's not often you get the opportunity to praise your council officials here, and formal ones, but can I say that Conn Murray was manager in Louth for a very successful period, and I must say that Joe McGuinness, if I might say it, has been absolutely fantastic in his commitment in the work that I've seen him do, certainly in County Louth in terms of CPOs, and Paddy Donnelly now is, I know they're changing roles at the moment, but I just want to say that the benchmark that I would have in efficiency and accountability, I think, is Louth County Council in what they're doing in housing. I was glad to hear another deputy, Darragh, praising the work in County Louth. And it's been my view, and I've expressed it here a number of times, that the CPO project, whatever way you look at it, I think that it needs a national lead. And I've said this to the Minister as well, that we ought to nationally have somebody in charge of CPO for the councils that aren't doing their job. Now, I'm not naming anybody here at all other than Louth, and I know they're doing a great job. I think that we could get 2,000 or 3,000 homes in the space of maybe 18 months if it's properly led with the enthusiasm and the commitment that you have in Louth County Council. And I really think I've gone around our town, I've gone around with a housing body, and they've picked up a number of homes out of that and they're refurbishing them. But I still feel the easy win is where you have the service, so you don't have to open up any land. The properties, the physical, you have to reconstruct or rebuild, but you have all the services there. You have the footpaths, you have the roads, you have the lighting, you have the sewage, you have the water. That is a much cheaper operation. And I think in now that maybe they could tell this to us again. I think the average cost was around 100, 110,000 over the whole CPO purchase from start to finish, all costs, legal costs and reconstruction costs or refurbishing costs. Now that is hugely advantageous to the taxpayer, and it's hugely advantageous to the families who go in there. And I think that it's a real blind spot in other counties, and it has to be driven. And I would appreciate maybe the views of the of people on this, because every single town centre is full of properties that could be activated. The other point I'd like to ask the council officials, if they feel that there's a need for, or what do they do to generate business in this area. For instance, I know that you identify empty homes that are boarded up, and there's a website for that. But how active are councils in relation to following up, say, where properties are unoccupied, particularly in town centres or in brownfield areas as well, that they could chase up the owners to see what they're doing with them and to proactively engage with them in terms of what incentives they are available to property owners, even if they are commercial properties, to change them back into or to put them into physical family or individual separate 1 or 2 bedroom units. And I feel that that will make a huge difference. We've gone from having a waiting list. I know if there's any of my colleagues here from the County Council who remember, maybe I'm serving even longer than you might be, but I remember when people were on the housing list, maybe for a year, at one year, and they had a house. And then it went out to maybe 3 years when Fianna Fáil were in power. But I want to say that to another colleague.
It was 13 years.
But I'm talking about the County Council, but they airbrushed me on instead of me. No, I think that was somebody else. But the fact is, it did, like, to ask a family with children to wait, and that the eldest child that comes in with the mother is nearly 10 years of age, is absolutely unacceptable. It's an appalling situation for families to be in, and it's very much our situation is just it continues obviously to improve, but it's still very difficult. So my other question is this, that I can remember, I don't know if anybody here can remember, the question of the National Building Agency when Drogheda Borough Council years ago wanted to build, say, 20 or 30 housing. They didn't have the necessary specialities in-house. So the National Building Agency at the time would construct and build for the council, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 houses. So all the design, all the professional fees and professional input that was needed was supplied. I know that I think Dublin City Council are acting in some way in that respect. Maybe I could have clarity on that. But it seems to me if you have that agency or a like body that will design and build for a council to the correct and proper standards, it would take a lot of the hard work that individuals might have to do in the council, that the agency would be able to supply and do for them. And the other point, the last point I want to make, is the opening up of land. Now we have a crisis in Drogheda, obviously, with money not being available to fund our development of our town on the northern side, and which will increase the number of the population in Drogheda by 20,000 over the next number of years. So are they making applications under other funding to open up that land? I know they weren't successful in the recent application. Have they made, or will they be making an application to open up that land in terms of maybe building some of that road, that Northern Cross route? Have they applied to government departments for that? And the last and the final point is, I find that the McVerry Trust, they're very proactive in the issue of acting as agents for people who are homeless. And I know they're in County Louth now, and I welcome again the new connectivity there is between Louth County Council and agencies like the McVerry Trust and other ones. Now, the McVerry Trust is one I'm particularly aware of. But I feel there's a huge increasing opportunity for councils and for approved housing bodies to work together. So thank you, Chairman.
I want to go back and get some quick answers, because I'm afraid Darragh has to go at 15:15, and then I'll come back to Declan. And then I'll come back to Declan and Owen. I'll start again maybe with Galway if...
Okay, Chair. If I may first deal with the CPO question. We've actually completed 3 CPOs this year. And we've already brought proposals to table to build a 7-house scheme on one of those. And the CPO is not always necessary, because we've done 30 acquisitions this year, which have been 30 acquisitions of vacant homes. We've negotiated the purchase.
That's true, but you mentioned in your, and that's true, and that's what I'm asking, but you mentioned that there's 500 vacant units in the city, so are they the ones you're targeting?
And exactly that.
Okay,
the 500, the CSO said we had 3,500 vacant homes.
Okay, yeah.
The Geo-Directory said we had 200. Through our vacant homes officer, we've gone out on the ground and we've identified what's there.
Okay.
And there's about 100 of those potentially available to us.
Okay.
We did a survey of 100 homes, and we discovered 70 weren't vacant. And of the remaining 30, there was issues to do with gentrification, people in nursing homes, fair deal, probates, family disputes. So the actual number of houses that's actually available is considerably less than as appears on paper. Okay. We are actively out there looking at the brownfield sites. We have processes in place to deal with a number of those at the moment. And where we can buy properties by acquisition, we're doing that. one of the reasons we have 60 plus void homes at the moment is the ones we've bought are now in our void stock being renovated at the moment to go into the social housing stream.
Good. Good. Thank you.
Mr. Murray.
Just again, picking up on the CPO aspects of it, we would have 3 commenced in recent times, but we were using Derelict Sites Act, which is a compulsory acquisition, which mightn't come under the heading of CPO. And we use it slightly differently and have used it successfully because we established an urban and village renewal unit specifically to work throughout the county, and we had carried out a full land management assessment within the actual metropolitan area to identify lands and areas for development itself. So we took a different process, and just as Brendan is saying there, we have successfully acquired where necessary in order to deliver. And our housing programme, in one sense, is part and parcel of our overall regeneration programme as well, and that must be part and parcel of the output that we deliver on. So it's not that we don't use the CPO, we know when to use the CPO, and I think that's an important aspect of here, and every authority has to make that call in that regard. In terms, again, of structuring ourselves to deliver, we have now restructured within the organisation, thanks to the opportunity through the merger, with a social housing directorate specifically to respond to Rebuilding Ireland. We have a design and delivery unit with the expertise now built in, with the resources there to actually manage design, delivery, procurement as a single unit and develop that expertise, and that can be shared too as we go forward into the future itself. In relation to the loans, you raised that question. We are aware the Minister is carrying out a review. We did actually, as a sector, look for that as well. We are participating on it. I don't have the stats to date as we're going through that process, and we will be feeding into the Minister. We believe it's an excellent product. We believe there are more opportunities.
Well, the low-cost loan is great. Thanks for your answer, Mr. Murray. Just to say, though, is every application going to the housing agency in all of your local authorities?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
It is. And I sit on the
for
housing
final
agency.
decision or for recommendation?
For recommendation primarily, but having said that, we have made decisions at local level based on the candidates that we produced, which may be different to the recommendation we received from the housing agency, because we know the locality.
Well, where we're on to that, and I know oversight's important, so
yes.
I get that. So, but on average, how long does that lengthen the term of the processing of the mortgage application? Like, how long does it sit in the housing agency for generally?
Well, again, I wouldn't have that detail, but I know, in fairness, I have a question on my mind as to whether we're not given the responsibility, as we have the authority, to make the decision at local level, as to why there is the oversight exists. I understand oversight, but at the end of the day, I know who's accountable.
Well, would be my question, and that's what I think. But thank you, and I appreciate it. Sorry.
Mr. McGuinness.
On the loan application, every loan application for our loans goes to the housing agency for their recommendation and comes back to the credit committee. There is not a delay in that journey to the housing agency and back.
What's the time period that it stays in the housing agency for then? If you send it to the housing
short
agency?
number of weeks. Short number of weeks.
Okay. Good.
Mr. Moran.
Okay. I suppose in relation to the CPO, we haven't used our powers under the CPO. I suppose when you see, as I outlined, we have a very significant acquisition programme. There's still good value for us, and I suppose similar to what Brendan mentioned, the units we acquire, by and large, a high level of those are vacant sites, so we are bringing, so it is achieving that purpose. I suppose one of the things we have done over the last year is that we've carried out a health check on 2 of our towns in the county, and particularly in the Tralee area. We've identified vacancy, analysed that, and certainly we are looking at the moment where CPO may be appropriate, and we're assessing each of those properties between dereliction and vacancy. I suppose the other thing in relation to that we have done is that we have introduced a significant change to our development contribution scheme to stimulate the reuse of vacant property. Our overhead, we've exempted reuse of first floor in our development contribution, and we've very significantly changed the contribution to stimulate the smaller house and the reuse within the brownfield. So we feel that's a positive thing for us to have done. So I think that's...
Thanks, and just to say, last here, that's one of the reasons I asked that, because it provides a clarification in relation to use of CPO powers and other things that are in your armoury to use it. So again, I welcome the opportunity that each of the local authorities have been able to clarify what you're doing. But I take it very clearly that any vacant house within your area is all on your radar, and so that's come across very clearly. So thanks.
Declan and then on. It's great to see, as Deputy O'Dowd said, some former colleagues and current colleagues here. Well,
You're all the praise you're getting.
could I say
Emails are being sent right now.
Could I say, Chair, that Professor O'Brien always has a problem with me? But that said, no, I just wanted to just go back on the issue of, and I hope I'm not repeating myself and coming a wee bit late, the issue of the pressure that's on the local authorities in relation to land purchase loans, in relation to the availability of money to repair voids. Is that an issue or not? The Minister clearly has said to me in recent days in the Chamber that any local authority who has voids, who are not in a position to repair them, that if there's an application in, I think I said by the 14th of December, that he certainly will be prepared to provide additional money for voids. He said that categorically last week. On the issue of CPOs, I'm not going to back over the praise of various local authorities in relation to it, but a bee in my bonnet, and there's three people certainly on the panel here who will know for years and years the issue of vacant rural housing. I want to know I know there's a huge concentration on urban. Anybody who's an election candidate or a council candidate will know the number who traverse the roads, will know the degree of vacant rural housing, and I want to know to what degree they are being identified. You know, if there were one or two taken back into use in every parish in this country, it would rejuvenate every local school that has a problem, and indeed provide funding to go around the local community. And I certainly believe that, you know, synergies with indeed the IFA and community organisations, if funding were made available, not necessarily through the local authority, but with the help of the local authority, that we could clearly identify a lot. And they're there. In fact, there are houses there, and I know there are problems with legalities at times, houses there with the furniture still in them that people haven't returned to, not to talk about empty houses. And lastly, just the issue of student accommodation. It has always struck me, and again I'm referring to my own county, that particularly in the area of say the DKIT, the Dundalk Institute of Technology, a lot of the traditional houses around there are large garden houses, that there should be some, and I did mention this to Darragh O'Brien, there should be some incentive to encourage the use of, dare I use the word, granny flats or singular extensions to the rear of large gardens in the vicinity of college areas, where there would be incentive given to, in a lot of cases, a lot of more elderly owners to actually provide sunroom, dare I call it, type accommodation, where students would be able to avail of it, and some form of grant made available to people who own the plots of land. And I'd just like, has anybody got a view on that? And thank you for your time.
Owen?
Thanks, Pat. Three quick follow-up questions. I suppose to go back to my original question about the gap between the real social housing need and the targets in terms of increase of real stock. The problem is in each of the four local authorities that the gap is very stark. So, for example, if you take Galway, the gap between the additions to the stock over the lifetime of Rebuilding Ireland and the real level of need is about 65%. In Louth, it's 74%, in Kerry, it's 59%, in Limerick, it's 71%. Now, given the fact that a number of you have said that private sector activity is very, very slow, if so much of your social housing need is to be met outside of local authority approved housing body build and acquisitions, and at the same time if the private sector isn't building, then you're not going to be able to meet those HAP and RAS targets. And leaving aside the fact that RAS and HAP are 2 or 4 years and therefore not necessarily in the best interest of tenant or good development of communities, just that gap is huge. And I think it's very, very worrying. So I know you have to work within existing policy, and I know the targets are set not on the basis of what you would like to do with the department. I suppose I just want to make that comment that the gap is really, really big, and that's going to create some difficulties. In terms of the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, and the product is really, really good, but the figures as of September for your four local authorities are very troubling. So Galway, for example, the city and county, sent 83 loan applications to the housing agency for underwriting. 22 were recommended. As of September, 0 have been drawn down. Louth, 50 were sent to the housing agency, 19 were recommended for approval, and only 5 have been drawn down. Kerry, 60 were sent to the housing agency for approval, 26 were sent back recommended, 0 have been drawn down, and Limerick, the figures are 46, 28 and 0. Now, I know it's only the first 3 quarters of the scheme, and that doesn't give us a full indication, but clearly there's a problem here somewhere, in the sense that, is it the fact that between the date of application and the date of final approval is longer than is necessary for the person then to be able to purchase the home? Is it that the amounts that are being offered are less than what the applicants need to purchase the home? Or, so this isn't a critical comment of the local authorities or the housing agency, but clearly the drawdowns indicate there's a problem. And those figures, by the way, that I quoted for the local authority sending to the housing agency, they're about half of the actual applications, because about half of the applications on average don't get sent to the housing agency. So I'm just interested in that. And finally, on traveller accommodation. So again, if I'm looking at last year and this year, Limerick had a very, very significant overspend in its traveller accommodation budget last year. But as of halfway through this year, it's way behind a completion of the full spend this year. Louth last year didn't have an allocation, didn't have a spend, but is significantly behind its allocation this year. Kerry last year spent roughly what you were allocated, but as of halfway through this year, you hadn't spent anything of the allocation. And Galway, dramatic underspend in the city last year, no spend in the county last year despite significant allocations. And as of halfway through this year, the county hadn't drawn anything down, and the city had drawn down a fraction of the 1 million or so was allocated. So my specific question is just, do you think you're going to spend all of the money that was allocated this year? And for those that had underspends last year, will you also carry that over and have an overspend this year? Because one of the big concerns of this committee is year on year, very, very significant underspends. And while I live in the real world, I have a large traveller community in my own constituency, I understand the complexities. We're about to have a revised estimates next week. Significant overspend in social housing. We had a significant overspend in social housing last year, very welcome, yet significant underspends both the last 3 years in traveller accommodation, and that's something that's very troubling.
Okay, we'll quick have a run around. Start with Galway again.
I might leave Con to pick up on some of the general questions. The home loan approvals with us, firstly, I'm Galway City Council. I'm not here on behalf of Galway County Council. I'm just Chief Executive for one. So
that'll depend on a vote we're taking in about 2 hours' time.
Could change shortly.
We'll have a chat about that afterwards.
We can tell you what the bills are.
But the drawdowns are 0 in both the city and the county.
we have very, firstly, the approval periods from our are quick. There's less than 3 weeks with the housing agency in terms of turnaround time. We're approving up to 90% of the cost. We're giving the loan approvals. Part of the issue in Galway is the lack of private house building that's going on. And people are going out there with approvals in their back pocket trying to buy, and that becomes the problem. But there's no significant delays. It comes back to our credit committee. We don't always agree with what the housing agency recommends. And again, I don't think there's any delay at that end. The student accommodation piece in Galway is quite significant. We've about 1,000 student beds either recently through or in the planning process with Bord Pleanála. We have a requirement for a further 1,000 beds. They're being looked at in terms of some of the brownfield sites, and there's other proposals coming through. We have 3 strategic housing developments going to the board, which will involve student beds. And the importance of the student beds piece for us is that will free up pressure in the private sector, which in turn will help our social housing demand. In terms of HAP and RAS, we've actually exceeded our targets to date in 2018. We will meet our targets under Rebuilding Ireland, and that is because of the work being done by the housing team through the HAP Homeless Place Finder, through the Vacant Homes Officer. And I'm also delighted to report that we've had some successes also recently with the HAP Homeless Place Finder service, securing homes for members of the travelling community. We have very significant proposals in the pipeline under discussion with the Department in relation to new, bespoke, culturally appropriate with the travelling community involved in the design of facilities. We're doing something in relation to the Cooltraw site in Salt Hill, in relation to the Cara Brown site on the Headford Road, in relation to Circular Road. So we have and they are multi-million investments and developments. So the more money that's in that kitty, we'll be delighted, because, and that's not to underestimate the difficulties we've had trying to convince our elected members to support this, and also dealing with the concerns of the wider community. But we understand and appreciate and value the needs of the travelling community, and that's why we've formulated the proposals that, as I say, we're currently talking to the Department about.
I'm just very conscious of the time. We've only 8 minutes left, so if we can just get the response as quick as possible and we can let you back in, we will. Sorry, Mr. Murray.
Yeah, thank you. Just in relation to the travelling community, we will draw down our full process, and we have further capital appraisals with the Department for 6.5 million in terms of the work that we are doing. So we welcome more, is the way I'd put it in relation to that. And if there is something left over, we'd like to see it passed on as quickly as possible. In terms of the overall issue of lists versus the numbers that are in terms of need itself, that's always been a gap in terms of process. Now, when I look at figures, and again, working in housing for a long time, and again, this is not something which works from a national perspective, and I appreciate that. I've seen my list reduced by 35%, my actual housing list, and that's a fact which never gets mentioned. I've seen 2,500 tenancies given in the last 18 months to 2 years. And these are homes that people have received, whether it's under house, building, lease, or indeed HAP, RAS, or otherwise, in terms of accommodation. Decent accommodation have been provided, and I think it's an important point to continually make in that regard. Our targets in terms of the current year, we will exceed that target as best we can. From 251 homes in 2018, we expect to deliver maybe 300 in the current year, and that's through the buy, build and lease programmes that are there. In terms of the villages and the issue of dereliction, and particularly we have set up a very specific unit to actually target our villages in terms of local dereliction. We've assigned staff directly into the municipal districts to work with us in relation to that. The repair and lease scheme, which we think is exceptionally valuable in the context of responding to that, to try and keep life within the communities as distinct from allowing those communities to disappear over time itself. Now that's a very short response, Chair.
Mr. McGuinness.
Very quickly, in relation to the loud questions, the land loans versus the voids. Very simply, we have 60 million of land loans which we are repaying from internal capital receipts, and that is impacting on the spending of internal capital receipts. So that's the linkage there. Vacant rural housing and CPOs, we have used it in limited cases, but specifically where need is required. So, for example, we are CPOing currently houses for travel accommodation and disability needs, specifically in rural areas, because of the availability of those units. In relation to the Rebuilding Ireland loans, Deputy O'Brien is correct in one sense that sometimes the loan offers are not what the applicants were looking for. The value has been cut down. But the other issue I would mention is applicants are making multiple applications with adjoining counties. So we would get a good number of Dublin applicants who also apply to Meath, who also apply to Fingal. So they may not necessarily take up the loan with us, they may take it up with somebody else. Travel accommodation, we have an underspend this year. We have particular issues, and I'm sure it impacts in other counties in relation to where the needs have changed, where people have withdrawn their aspirations, and travel accommodation programmes have changed, whether at the review stage or whether at the new stage, due to feuding, and people's needs change.
Ms. Morrell, you.
I suppose just to address a few points there. I suppose just generally in relation to the Voids programme, you know, it's a very valuable programme to a county such as ourselves, a rural county with a big housing stock. I suppose the second point in relation to the traveller accommodation, that was the allocation was for a particular project, and the needs of the particular family involved in that situation were dealt with elsewhere. So, you know, we're satisfied that there was a the same provision with a different allocation. And I suppose just to say, for the new traveller programme for 2019, we've some very strong proposals in there. So I think it's just important to state that.
Owen? Yeah, no, Owen, and then yourself, Fergus.
Just some point of order. I did ask before on. I have to do a radio interview shortly. Just the Northern Cross route application for opening up the land for development. I just want to find out has the application
Mr. McGill.
made.
Yeah, the application has gone into the department. No decision has been made.
Okay.
Under what funding? Sorry.
Under the bundle 3 of the PPP project.
Thank you. Thanks. That's grand.
Just Brendan, the response is very positive. The significant underspend in the city last year and the significant gap in the spend so far this year, are you confident that most of that will be spent this year or will be rolled over for completion next year? I appreciate pipelines are movable feasts, but the underspends in the city in particular have been very significant for a number of years. And I suppose the hope is that all of that money is eventually spent. When do you think it would be?
Well, the review of the traveller accommodation programme sat on the council agenda for 18 months, and I was pushing it, and it took that length to get support for it. The allocation that was made to us in 2018, we actually didn't look for it. It was given to us in error. We're very definite in the money we're looking for in 2019. And Chair, just one comment. Thank you for taking our submission as read. We made 8 recommendations to the committee in terms of our submission. We will certainly advocate you would look at those in terms of your deliberations.
We will indeed. I just want to ask a few questions myself. Just in relation to local authority voids and since your own voids, does any authority here have sold their own stock of housing because the cost of refurbishment was too excessive or because lack of funding was coming from central government to bring them back into use? And just more or less specifically in relation to Galway, and I know Galway cities are the only ones here, and Deputy Rabbit was in my ear last night in relation to the difference in the qualification for local authority housing, whereas in the city is 35 and in the county is 25. Is that having an implication in relation to housing in Galway? So is the homeless HAP officer in Galway City able to locate the tenants in Galway County and then taking stock out of Galway County? So is that differential of local authority, that 10,000 difference, which is quite significant, a gap in local authority approval, is that causing problems for tenants in the county trying to get accommodation in Galway City or vice versa?
Yeah, Chairman, I can take that one. It is. We have had a number of situations where county applicants who are above the county limit have made an application to the city, which has a higher income eligibility. Their requirement is for HAP accommodation in the county, and in some cases they've secured a property, they have a willing landlord, but they can't enter into a HAP arrangement because they don't meet the eligibility criteria in the county, so they're drifting to the city to try and get on the city waiting list with a county preference. That, I suppose, has arisen a number of times in the past. Our HAP place finder officer has secured a number of properties in the county, and that's based on the individual preference for that family who want to be housed in the county. We're roughly 44 tenancies to date, probably 8 of those are in the county. So that's, roughly 1/5.
Okay, thank you.
We haven't sold any voids.
Okay.
Yeah, just we haven't sold any voids, but we have transferred stock to an AHB in order to deliver, which is a slightly different process, but not sell.
No. Okay. Grant. Oh, sorry.
And Brendan, you're right. Just to say that the recommendations will be taken seriously by the committee. The one that concerned me when I was looking at them was what you're saying is the value for money exercise drifting down to 15 million. Like that doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Are you saying that projects below 20 million you're being asked to undertake those exercises?
Very simply, like Louth, we have 32 million of legacy land loans. Funding those loans and bringing those loans on the land that we can use to build obviously affects the value that we can achieve. We have one scheme which has been, the business case is gone to deeper. It is taking quite a bit of time. But because some of that land has also now been put forward other schemes, we find that the threshold is being brought down to 15 million in respect of that. That's our experience.
And what's the rationale from that, from the department or the NDFA's point of view?
I would presume it's the cost of the land loans. We're carrying, as I said, 32 million of legacy land loans that we bought at the height of the market in accordance with department policy. we're carrying that in the city. We're trying to use that land for various purposes, and the cost of that land and those loans is impacting what we're trying to do.
And just the last question, how much time does that cost-benefit analysis place? How much additional time in terms of the overall development? Is it like 3 months, 6 months?
It's been significant, and one of the projects as well also involves a bespoke traveller accommodation programme solution.
So are we talking months?
We're talking months, yeah.
Thanks, Pat.
Okay. I would like to thank all the witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee, and we will acknowledge all the submissions or all the opening statements, and we'll take them into account. This meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Wednesday, the 12th of December at 9:30, and it's a quarterly update on rebuilding Ireland with Minister Murphy. Thank you.